All right, so our guest today is Jotham Parsons, whose work many of you have read. I know a bunch of you have read his Church and Republic book on Gallicanism, which is one of the few studies of Gallicanism when it actually mattered. Most of them focus on a much later period when it was really, in fact, a lot less important than it was in the period you studied. And his most recent book was on money and money and coinage in late 16th century France. What was the title of it?
Making Money in 16th Century France.
Making Money in 16th Century France, which was the first study that he and I talked about it years ago. Serious study of the currency reform of Henry III. There was one brief period from 1577 to the early 17th century when an actual coin, the écu, was used as the money of account. Other than the rest of the time they used it as tournoi, which was just an arbitrary money of account. And so what was behind this reform, which had largely been ignored until, there was a little bit, but you're really in open territory on this, and it's a wonderful book that I recommend to everybody. If you want to understand not simply government finance, but politics and larger social problems that you live on wars of religion. Essential reading, in my view. Before we start, normally, Jotham, we'll quickly go around so you can have every person, we all know each other, because everybody's been sitting in these rooms for all year, so that's kind of pointless, but it is good to quickly introduce yourself.
I'm Dave Menezes. I'm a first year PhD student. I study early modern South Asia, particularly Dutch and the Portuguese.
Excellent.
Elizabeth Cross, assistant professor. I work on France and its empire in the 18th century.
I've seen your stuff.
Yes, yes, we've met before.
Mike Letta, I'm a master's student. I study German economic history.
Tom Adams, retired NEH, and work on social welfare history.
And we've met before.
Indeed, an old regime.
Yep.
I'm Eddie Cola. I work on mostly revolutionary history and legal history.
I'm Brenna Cameron Stanky. I'm a first year PhD student here, and I study medieval environmental history.
I'm Natalie Donnell. I'm a first year PhD student here, and I work on women in politics, mostly in the wars of religion.
I'm Lee Stevens, PhD student here, working on the French Wars of Religion.
Susan Naramore, I'm a master's student in politics and art in early modern Europe.
Sokhan Ken, I'm a 50-year PhD student working on tolerance in 17th century France.
Jacob Burnham, I'm a third-year PhD student working on France and its empire in the 17th century.
Jim Shadell. I'm one of the professors in the department, and I do Central Europe and the Habsburg monarchy.
All right, so Jotham's going to talk to us today about a topic that I was wondering if he was going to go make me read something I wrote 30 years ago, but no, he's not. That's good. It's a different focus entirely on the real housewives of 17th century France.
Yes, and you're very much getting a work in progress here. As you can tell from the fact that I'm still using the slightly obnoxious working title that I came up with. If anybody has an idea for a real title, please let me know. So this is not a complete work. You're going to get bits and pieces which will hopefully come together in a larger project. But just to say one word about the much bigger project that this is a part of, which is that I have been interested in the social vision that one sees in the pious literature of the 17th century. 17th century France was notoriously a pious society. This is the siècle des saints. And it's the age of Jansenism, it's the age of medieval, but not a whole lot of digging has been done into the often less spectacular religious literature of the 17th century. And I'm interested in the way in which that both reflected and shaped the understanding of society that 17th century French people had. And this part of it, as you'll see, deals with the sort of roughly the 1640s, but I sort of carry it ultimately down to the reign of Louis XIV. We'll get there eventually at the end of this. Okay, so with no further ado, The fourth story of Bishop Jean-Pierre Camus' first collection, and there were several, of blood-curdling moral tales, entitled The Amphithéâtre Sanglant, concerns a young man with a monastic vocation. The only child of a prosperous and pious family, he meets obstacles from parents who do not want to give him up to the cloister as they approach old age. He manages to extract from them a promise that they will cease their opposition in the unlikely event that a baby brother should appear, which of course is exactly what happens. Still, they prevaricate, despite warnings about divine wrath, and indeed it is not long before they both meet gory deaths. At that point, Theodora, for so our protagonist is named, quote, having done his final duties at their funerals, made a sacrifice of praise to God for having broken his bonds, and entering among the theaters, left all his heritage to his younger brother. And if he has not died in the past few years, he is still living among those holy persons with great perfection. That was, of course, a typographical error. It was no doubt in the Theatine order, not in the theatrical troupe, that Theodora found holy persons of great perfection. But the error, overlooked by copy editors and even repeated in the subsequent edition, is evocative not just of the collection's title, but of its cultural movement. The 1630s and 1640s, which Corneille bestrode as the Colossus, were the high point of heroic theatre and its influence on French court and noble culture. More generally, the culture was impregnated with a rhetoric of heroic exemplarity, to which Camus enthusiastically contributed. This work, as he noted at the beginning of Theodora's tale, being oriented not so much towards authorities as toward examples, and singular examples. Narrating and performing heroism shaped, or was meant to shape, social life to an extraordinary degree. Camus' tales were actually often short on heroes, but they abounded in bloodshed. The eighth one, Le Faux Ami, for example, was essentially Cyrano de Bergerac told as a revenge tragedy. A gentleman wooing an heiress slightly above his station enlists the aid of his well-connected friend, who adroitly appropriates the young woman for himself, even persuading the friend that the game had not been worth the candle. But eventually the trickster quarrels with his new wife, reveals his scam to her, and for good measure hits her. Outraged, she turns to her old suitor, reveals the truth to him, and begins an affair that ends, when her husband discovers it, in an indiscriminate orgy of murder. The lesson of this and innumerable other similar stories was clear. Uncontrollable violence surrounded familial strategies of marriage, sexuality, and reproduction, ready to be triggered by any act of impiety. And only exceptional piety, in turn, could salvage such disasters, and that not always. The first half of the 17th century, the French civil wars were in partial remission, but France was still a society racked by violence. Besides the endemic brigandage and criminality of most of pre-modern Europe, it was suffering through the height of a dueling epidemic that was, in turn, as Stuart Carroll has argued, just the tip of an iceberg of private violence and feuding. And in that context, as Carroll notes, quote, family breakdown was a pressing problem, leading to violence, political disorder, and feuds. We're all familiar with the long-running, or at least those of us who've done seminars in early modern French history, are familiar with the long-running campaign by the royal authorities to impose patriarchal control on marriages and marriage strategies. A campaign that, as Caroline Lugy, for example, has suggested, did not enjoy any especially conspicuous success. Meanwhile, violent clashes over family strategy and family authority went all the way to the top. In 1609-1610, Henri IV's clumsily telegraphed attempt to rape Charlotte de Montmorency seemed about to lead to an international war, when it led instead to his assassination. And a decade later, France witnessed a brief, actually too brief, but unpleasant, guerre de la mère et du fils between the king and the queen mother, which didn't really end. They just kept getting repeated in different forms. It's certainly no surprise that violent reactions to familial dilemmas were everywhere in French culture at the time. But beyond, as we would say, processing this traumatic reality, people wanted to at least imagine how it could be resolved. Christian piety, in the inflection of the Dévot movement and the Catholic Reform generally, seemed to provide a promising answer. More specifically, people turned to figures of heroic female piety. Such figures stood at the intersection of several of that cultural movement's powerful tropes. The Dévote, of course, but also the self-aggrandizing imagination of what Horace Ronan has called the last heroes, and the cumulative impact of a century of off-and-on Queen Mother's regent. But such narratives also offered a way to figure a certain kind of order, one in which the divine would merely supervene on an anarchic, patriarchal world of disordered passion. There were more straightforward and practical attempts in the period to deal with perceived epidemic of disorder in similar ways. Richelieu's state Catholicism, the proliferation of new religious orders, especially female religious orders, and charitable enterprises, or, for example, the Compagnie de Saint-Sacrement. This one remained more of a literary trope than anything else, but it was a revealing one nonetheless. It helps show how aware the French were of the deleterious role of gendered and sexualized violence in their societies, and the ways in which they were willing to contemplate other than purely patriarchal solutions to it. It's also a significant chapter in the complex story of how the religious imagination of the siècle des cent influenced the way the French understood and shaped their society. A classic problem, but one about which we still have much to learn. But given that this is still a work in progress, I'll proceed to discuss, as I said, an incomplete and not fully articulated set of examples of how narratives of familial violence and feminized Christian heroism functioned roughly in the 1640s. I'll begin with a historical incident that enjoyed a certain notoriety in its day, and indeed continued to echo down into what is clearly the single most important text concerning 17th century France. Dumas' Trois Mousquetaires. Then, after a brief discussion of the exemplary and didactic literature concerning female heroism and its relation to family life and marital strategy, I'll turn to some canonical literature. Pierre Corneille's dramas of martyrdom, Polyeucte Martyr and Theodora, Vierge et Martyr, which in turn were part of a broader movement to bring the saints to the stage. In guise of conclusion, I'll present a few thoughts about what happened to this discourse, which seems to have changed or died out in the 1650s, but may have had an indirect, though important, influence down to the end of the century and beyond. So, to the morning of the 8th of August, 1648. On that day, a wealthy and pious young widow, Jean-Pierre Camus, who had been among the witnesses to her marriage contract, left her late husband's father's house in the Paris suburb of Issy, traveling by carriage past Saint-Cloud to visit the Church of the Holy Cross that Richelieu and Anne of Austria had constructed, with convenient carriage access, at Mont-Valérien. As befitted this tumultuous period, though, the Fronde would break out at the end of the month. Her decorous progress in this act of royally sanctioned upper-class devotion was rudely interrupted. A small troop of horsemen ambushed her and her companions, seized their carriage, and despite an escape attempt on her part in the woods of Livry, took her on a journey of perhaps 140 kilometers to the Château Fort of Launay in the vicinity of Sens. The, quote, handsome and spacious chateau with a drawbridge encircled by large moats, contemporary description, was a commandery of the Grand Priory of the Order of Malta. The order's jurisdictional exemptions, particularly for its Paris commandery, gave rise to a fair amount of lawlessness and disorder. So the contrast between the royal and sacral order of Mont-Valérien and the feudal license of Launay was, if not deliberate, at least striking. And the kidnapper, who soon appeared in person, was the nephew of the Grand Prior of the order, Roger de Bussy-Raboutin, an aristocratic widower and officer of mediocre talent, later to be famous as a memoirist, correspondent of his cousin, Madame de Sévigné, and author of the Histoire amoureuse des Gorges. Once installed in the chateau, her biography says, emissaries appeared alternately, menacing this woman, whose name was Madame de Miramillon, with all sorts of violence, and making her the most advantageous offers to get her to marry Monsieur de Bussy. But when the gentleman himself finally arrived, quote, as much a man of spirit and courage as he was, the presence of a woman intimidated him. I swear, she cried on seeing him, I swear before the living God, my creator and yours, that I will never marry you. Some combination of her force of personality, his own allegedly honorable intentions, and use of the machinery of royal justice was being mobilized against him at Sens, persuaded Bussy-Raboutin to release the lady, and she was soon back with her family, somewhat the worse for wear. An incident that could easily have found a home in Bishop Camus' bloody amphitheater, or on the tragic stage, ended in fact with neither party too seriously damaged. Miramillon suffered from physical and doubtless psychological shock, while Bussy-Raboutin apparently had to make a significant financial settlement, but both recovered. The interesting question is how? On Bussy-Raboutin's side, the answer to that question is straightforward and fits well with our understanding of contemporary aristocratic society. He retained the confidence of his patron, the Grand Condé. who made something of a strategy, apparently, of encouraging marriage by hapt, or kidnapping, among his entourage. And even had the young prince disapproved, the deteriorating political situation would have made him reluctant to cut off a well-connected client. Between Condé's spectacular victory at the Battle of Rouen on 20th of August and the outbreak of the Parisian Fronde almost immediately thereafter, Condé had more than enough influence to win a pardon for his protégé. Quote, he wrote to Bonneau, that's Miramillon's father, as Boussy-Radotin said, in a style redolent not just of a prince of the blood, but of a victorious one, so that this letter reduced my adversaries to silence. Even if he stopped short of predatory bloodshed, Boussy-Radotin was a model of the old-school tumultuous noble. It's not surprising that he experienced both the stick and the carrot of the adult Louis XIV's campaign against that shrine, spending time in the Bastille before settling into an honorable submission in the Académie. Miramillon's biographer, actually there were a couple of them, they told much the same story, but with a nuance. Madame de Miramillon, as a perfect Christian, pardoned him at the prince's prayer. Here, the agency was hers rather than her family's. And more importantly, the context was that of Christian virtue rather than power politics. Structurally, her biographer presented her ordeal as a martyrdom. It began on the road to Calvary, followed by her courage in the face of captivity. Madame de Miramillon refused physical comfort in the form of food, drink, or even a seat, made her refusal to marry Boussy-Radotin a profession of faith, and then forgave her tormentor. Her own take on the incident in a spiritual testament some 30 years later was not all that different. Quote, I was kidnapped. God gave me great grace, and I never lost my judgment. That was the first grace I asked of him, to be always filled with confidence in him, and to give me courage and force to defend myself. God gave me courage that could only have come from him alone. I went more than 36 hours without eating. When I returned from my kidnapping, I was deathly ill. If the experience was a physical martyrdom, then it also led through a spiritual death to rebirth. Specifically, back to her biographer here, when she was healed, she thought more than ever about advancing on the paths of perfection, and took as a spiritual director Monsieur de Festet, a severe man whose doctrine was not suspect. She spent 6 months in the monastery of the Daughters of the Visitation, and left it only because all of her family begged her to, leading up to her definitive conversion and, not coincidentally, a vow of perpetual virginity, although she never did join a formal monastic order. Boussy-Radotin claimed to have been misled into his adventure by Miramillon's previous confessor, though according to the more reliable testimony of her niece, the culprit was in fact primarily her mother-in-law's spiritual director. Either way, it's easy to see why Miramillon wanted to start over. Very significantly, besides being politically reliable and culturally moderate, the Visitation sisters, as Christopher Lane's research has shown, had a record of welcoming women who had stood up to sexual assault and imposed their piety on dangerous household situations. One, placed in a household with an abusive and seemingly lecherous master in the 1640s, quote, experienced such extraordinary helps of divine providence that many of them could only pass for miracles, especially on occasions when her honor and her salvation were in danger. Another physically fought off a would-be rapist, leaving a scar on his face. There's every reason to think that at the Visitation, Miramillon found not just safety and spiritual solace, but a reading of her experience that made her its protagonist and indeed its hero. In other words, one that imposed exactly this kind of feminine Christian heroism on the, what by that time was completely out of control security situation in France. One striking thing about Miramillon's story, not so prominent in Camus, for example, though it was not absent either, was something that endeared it to writers and something that endeared it to later writers, and it showed up quite a bit later on in the century in different forms, was its atmosphere of heroism, and particularly those contrasting heroisms of Miramillon and Boussy-Radotin. Female heroism had a history as an important literary trope stretching back through Boccaccio's 1362 De Claris Mulieribus into antiquity. One locus classicus was Plutarch's essay on the virtues of women, which, like the rest of his moral works, was much read in 17th century, particularly in France. Plutarch's collection of exempla is instructive. While he stated that his purpose was to provide, quote, an historical demonstration of the virtue of the virtue of man and woman is one and the same, which is an issue we'll come back to. For the most part, he showed women supplementing the military and civic virtues of male citizens. They spur men on or occasionally replace them as warriors and tyrannicides. The stage of their virtue is that of political violence, and they confirm rather than challenge that violent order, though they do, importantly, sometimes show a special piety in the way that they do that. That vocabulary of female heroism was an available model in mid-17th century France. The classic case, also from the orbit of the Comte Condé, was that of the Grande Mademoiselle, the Duchesse de Montpensier, who on the 2nd of July 1652 took over military and political command of Paris from her feckless and conveniently ill father, Gaston d'Orléans, commanding operations that allowed Condé's trapped army to take refuge within the city walls. It could even be given a distinctly Christian cast. The most prominent example was the Jesuit Pierre Lemoine's very famous Galerie des Femmes Fortes from 1647, heavily stocked with queens and warriors who upheld divine order by stateswomanship and arms. And even so, Lemoine's project was more grounded than it appears on its surface. It wasn't just about Old Testament queens. Alongside his earlier Peinture Morale from 1641 to 43, it formed part of a rhetorical project in the most sophisticated Jesuit mode, designed to excite and direct the imaginations of its admittedly elite readers towards a concrete reordering of their lives according to divine principles. The Galerie was seemingly also designed to meet criticisms of the more emblematic Peinture, lack gravity and exemplarity. So for Lemoine, even this rather old-fashioned kind of exemplary female sanctity was a particularly powerful tool for bringing moral order to the French elites. A less popular but more immediately relevant example was François de Canailles' 1639-1640 treatise on l'honnête fille. This eccentric man of letters was going to be appointed in 1644 as historiographer to Gaston d'Orléans. He spent the next few years working unsuccessfully as his agent in the troubles of the Fronde. And so he was not unfamiliar with that milieu of troublesome family politics, though it does seem that he wrote this treatise before he really got into the political side of things. He also spent some time in the monastery as a youth. His extensive project, which stretched across a good solid half a dozen volumes, which I'm only going to discuss a very small amount of, was built on two premises. Plutarch's dictum that the virtues of women and men were the same, quote, even though we are of a different sex from them, we are not of a different species. And a conviction that feminine virtue, while equal to its male counterpart in kind and heroism, took its form overwhelmingly in the closely related context of religious devotion and the dangerous ground of erotic encounters. Canailles was self-consciously pro-feminist and advocated rather liberal positions on educational and physical opportunities for girls. But he was quite conventional in his views about feminine honor and its precarity. And he devoted the final section of this treatise to the dangers of seduction and betrayal, and the importance of religious devotion in resisting them. Crucially, he described this terrain of marital strategies and their discontents as a scene of female heroism, or générosité, to use his preferred term. For Canailles, the ubiquity of male disorder was a proof of female heroism. Since all men have declared themselves against these queens to strip them of their honor, they need great generosity to withstand so many attacks. Canailles professed that, quote, we are no longer in the time of tyrants and barbarians. Now one does not ravish the honors of girls unless they desire it. It is not violence that carries them off. It is softness. Madame de Miramillon would have begged to differ. And in fact, the number and ferocity of Canailles' exempla belied that naively optimistic perspective. On the negative side, he held out the duelist, willing to kill, die, and destroy his goods or honor over the most trivial slight. A heroism without and indeed opposed to Christian virtue that leads to violence and disorder. On the positive side are the catalogue of civic heroines and warriors found in the Plutarchic tradition, but above all, a bevy of saints and martyrs. From the inevitable Joan of Arc, to the mortifications of Catherine of Siena, to Roman martyrs, to, quote, an abbess of England who cut off her nose along with all of her nuns to prevent barbarians from violating their chastity through this holy madness. But all the while, the main point of this heroism resides in the specific and quotidian terrain of sexuality. Quote, these examples are truly admirable, but they are not always imitable. We have enough great heroes in the army without having to employ princesses. This was before the combat Moselle's exploits. I ask only that they fight in the household to maintain their honor. The practical import of his doctrine remained, it must be said, somewhat vague compared to the vividness of his examples and the richness of the literary tradition from which they arose. The generalized fear that family strategy could erupt into violence and the perceived need for checks on that tendency was in no way unique to 17th century France. In one form or another, it was a structural component of to use the fine German term, the alteuropäische Ökonomie, and probably of almost any pre-industrial agrarian society. It depends on if it's a society of inheritance, a society where survival depends on the execution of family strategy, and where the stakes, therefore, are always of the highest. It was also the locus of those. It was also the locus of those desires that early modern Europeans saw as inherently unchecked, not just lust, which might burn itself out, but the classic pair of ambition and avarice, which knew no bounds. Although state power could certainly do a better or worse job of containing such desires, under pre-industrial conditions, the ceiling of its effectiveness was neither very high nor very often reached. Thus, the cultural tradition of the West was replete with stories in which disordered sexual, marital, and family strategies brought about chaos and violence. Aside from innumerable biblical examples, one need look no further than, say, the Homeric judgment of Paris or the suitors of Penelope. Solutions to this problem were equally widespread and diverse, as in Plutarch's charming description of Chios, where courtship was so elegant and orderly that, quote, when a maid was espoused to one youth, the rest presently gave off courting of her. The effect of this good order among the women was that no mention was made of any adultery or fornication among them for the space of 700 years. It doesn't really explain how they did that. As in this case, though, it was not always evident what the relevance of such narratives was to the social conditions of 17th century France. But as Kanai implied, one set of classical stories that was found suitable and that carried enormous authority was the lives of the early martyrs. Aside from the Gospels, these were the most important available accounts of Christian heroism, central to Christian culture from its very earliest days. As the Catholic Reform movement and the exigencies of anti-Protestant polemic focused attention on the early church and the historical continuities of Roman Catholicism, the salience of these stories was only enhanced. Caesar Baronius's 1586 edition of the Roman Martyrology officially initiated this tendency, and it was consecrated exactly in the middle of our period in 1643, with the publication of the first volume of the monumental Acta Sanctorum. They've mostly finished it now. This process did more than just move the tales of the saints and martyrs closer to the center of Catholic devotion and identity. By placing them under the sign of the classical discipline of history, it gave them a new kind and maybe an additional kind of social and pedagogical authority, so that, quote, sacred history, as Bollandus had it, ought to be esteemed as truly the guide of life, the light of counsel, the mistress of mores. Those are Ciceronian terms. According to this logic, the lives of the saints could take on the exemplary and social disciplinary role of classical literature, a development that fit perfectly into an era of Christian humanism and Christian stoicism. And it was a form of heroism equally open to men and women. The feminine martyrs, as I said, had no less courage than the masculine martyrs. Well, Camus' bloody amphitheater and the more or less romanticized tale of heroic womanhood we've looked at so far were connected loosely to the models of classical and Christian antiquity. One prominent genre brought them together with the questions of religion and family violence. In the second quarter of the 17th century, stories of the early martyrs briefly became a staple of the Paris stage. most notably in Pierre Corneille's very successful Polyeucte, first performed in 1643, and his second, much more problematic foray into the subject, Theodora, from 1645. Both of these plays were reflections on the power of classical and Christian virtues to overcome the violence and political disruption of clashes over family strategy and sexuality, stressing in particular the role of female heroism in that process. In my discussion of these plays, I haven't translated the Corneille's verse. Partly because I'm lazy and partly because Corneille, but I'll give at least summaries of what the verses say. So in the case of Polyeucte, Corneille made it very clear that these elements were his own addition to the sacred history, making it more suitable to the 17th century French stage, though potentially less exemplary. His, quote, ingenious interweaving of fictions with the truth took only broad inspiration from its rather obscure source, a notice of the medieval Byzantine hagiographer Simeon Metaphrastes that had made its way in Latin translation into a number of compendia of saints' lives. Specifically, Corneille sharply downgraded the role of Polyeucte's intimate friend Néarque, while expanding those of his wife Pauline and father-in-law Félix, and adding the entirely new character of Sévère, an old flame of Pauline's, now become the favorite and emissary of the persecuting Emperor Decius. This rearrangement of the story allowed Corneille to make his play into a family drama, in which the threat of a violent and lawless response to thwarted erotic ambitions worked in parallel with the Decian persecution to drive the tragic action. Félix, as recently appointed governor of Armenia, had married his daughter to Polyeucte, seigneur des Pyrénées d'Arménie, who a du nom et sort de rang des rois. So a Armenian noble from the race of the kings, perfectly suited to promote his political position. To the point that when Polyeucte was arrested as a Christian, la ville se rebelle et ne peut voir passer par le rigueur des lois sa dernière espérance et le sang de ses rois. Town rises in rebellion at the loss of the last of its king's blood. Initially, all goes well as the couple subjects itself to paternal and political authority, and Polyeucte's public conversion to Christianity, though certainly a problem, was extrinsic to the questions of family strategy that Félix and Pauline had posed for the states. But neither Félix nor Pauline could have full confidence that Sévère, who was an agent of Decius's anti-Christian policy, would show restraint. For Félix, the spokesman of traditional values, it was hardly conceivable that violence would not overwhelm his rational, if, as it turns out, ill-chosen family strategy. He has a whole long monologue on this. Que ne permettra-t-il à son ressentiment et jusqu'à quel point ne porte sa vengeance une juste colère avec tant de puissance? What will his resentment not give rise to? How far will a just anger coupled with so much power go? Peut-être ce soupçon n'est pas sans apparence, il rallume en son cœur déjà quelque espérance, et croyant bientôt voir Polyeucte puni, il rappelle en amour à grande peine bannie. Juge si sa colère en ce cas implacable le ferait en leçon de sauver un coupable. This is a suspicion without some appearance of truth that his love for Pauline is being relighted in his heart. And he believes that as he sees Polyeucte punished, it will recall his love of Pauline and judge if his anger, implacable in this case, will leave me innocent if I save a guilty man. While his own strategy should, by the same logic, proceed by equal violence through the execution of Polyeucte and the recruitment of Sévère. So he should play this game too. Te dirais-je en possède en digne, basse et lâche. Polyeucte est ici l'appui de ma famille, mais si par son trépasse l'autre épousait ma fille, j'acquerrais bien par là de puissants appuis qui me mettraient plus haut sans foi que je ne suis. Undignified and cowardly thought And that with Polyeucte gone, with his support there, he could acquire Sévère as a son-in-law, who would be even more powerful as the favorite of the emperor. Even if he resists that temptation, and it's actually not clear in the play that he does, Félix's destructive actions as an enemy of the Christians were governed by the logic of violent conflict over family strategy, rather than specific religious conviction. Even Pauline, who like Sévère is governed by what by all evidence is a very powerful stoicizing pagan virtue, had at least passing doubts about the ability of human nature to withstand the violent impulses of ambition and erotic attachment. Comme entre deux rivaux, la haine est naturelle. L'entrevue aisément se termine en querelle. It's a reaction to the prospect of Sévère and Polyeucte meeting. Since hatred is natural between two rivals, this meeting may well turn to a quarrel, which in the context really means a duel. She ultimately concludes that les âmes tous deux d'elles-mêmes maîtresses sont un ordre trop haut pour de telles bassesses. Both of their souls, mistresses of themselves, are too high for such lowness. But that level of heroism is one that literally transcends death. Sévère had returned from a reported death on the battlefield, while Polyeucte, of course, went to his heavenly reward. It's also worth noticing that, at least on stage, it was Pauline who did all the actual work of heroism. She frankly tells Polyeucte, so her heroism is her resistance of her continuing love for Sévère. And Polyeucte's Christian displays are all off stage. Right? And so she tells her husband of her meeting with her old lover, on souffre à résister, on souffre à s'en défendre. Et bien que la vertu triomphe de ses fûts, la victoire est pénible et le combat en tue. Resisting, one suffers in resisting, one suffers defending oneself. And though virtue triumphs over these flames, the victory is difficult and the combat is shameful. She thus adopts the familiar role of the hero, whose courage and virtue negate passionate and vicious violence that surround her. Her virtue, though, is not apparently Christian virtue. But this fault is remedied at the end of the play with her sudden and otherwise undermotivated conversion in the wake of Polyeucte's martyrdom. The end result of the play is that Polyeucte and Néarque go to their heavenly reward, and everybody else is happy. Félix and Pauline are Christian, and Sévère is going to leave them in peace and plead their case before the emperor. So in this case, the end result of the play is that divine intervention and Pauline's heroism actually do lead to a system of stability, order, and peace. Courtenay and his audience were clearly pleased with this presentation of saintly virtue and gendered strife, sufficiently so that he returned to the theme just 2 years later. If Polyeucte sought to play with the exemplarity of hagiography to confront Christian virtue, Roman virtue, and the fear, if not quite the reality, of violent and lawless conflict over marriage and sexuality, his follow-up in the murder drama genre, Theodora, was at once simpler and more complex. On the one hand, its lawlessness was far more central and straightforward, as the antagonist's lust and ambition drove the violent plot. On the other hand, its exemplarity was even more fraught. Rather than picking an obscure subject and allowing his imagination license, Corneille picked an incident from what was probably the single most prominent and important patristic source on exemplary female sanctity, the De Virginibus of Ambrose of Milan. That work excited, for example, the unrestrained admiration of Lemoine as a true masterpiece of sacred eloquence. I quote him, "Its diction is so pure, so exquisite, and so delicate. Its thoughts are so well chosen and studied, and there is everywhere such a great profusion of rhetorical flowers that he thought himself obliged to justify this by the condition of those persons to whom it would be presented, that is, holy virgins. It was also frequently before the eyes of the French public. A quick survey of the catalogue of the Bibliothèque Nationale shows 4 full or partial translations published between 1580 and 1645. And of course, there were a million Latin copies floating around that anybody who read patristic literature would have read it. So this source, at once dauntingly authoritative and potentially dangerously feminized, Corneille acknowledged freely in his preface. What he did not say, but clearly knew very well, was that this same subject had had an important fortune in the literature of the Italian Baroque. Tasso had taken it up in the second canto of the Gerusalemme Liberata, and it had been brought to the stage several times, most recently in 1635 and most spectacularly in Rome by Giulio Rospigliosi, the future Pope Clement IX. While the Italian sources offered a great deal of romantic incident and generally turned it into a love story, and Corneille adopted some of that, he remained within the basic conceptual framework present in Ambrose. The Bishop of Milan could not have stressed the exemplary virtue of his Martyrologies any more strongly. As he said in the encomium of St. Agnes that opens his treatise, and I'm translating here the 1645 French quote-unquote paraphrase, which is actually a fairly close translation. Quote, "One must dispose oneself for proper conduct, honnêteté, because she is a virgin, and make sacrifices because she is a martyr. To humble men, I say that it was a girl. To ravish women, I put her in their condition, their sex." Theodora, in Ambrose's account, was to supplement the inimitable examples of Agnes, Thecla, and the Virgin Mary. She did so not only by living and dying closer to Ambrose's own time, but by explicitly opposing the marriage market. This led, predictably, to violence. Quote, "Love is cruel when it is thwarted. After she had made known her final resolution, that is, her vow as a consecrated virgin, all her little importunants, that is, her suitors, filed out one after another. But in their place she saw as many enemies and executioners. She was denounced as a Christian, but she also took on the mantle of heroic virtue. Quote, that guilty woman is an Amazon who courts death in an unbreakable rock that will grow firmer if it is struck." At that point, as Ambrose admitted, the story took a turn to Hellenistic romance. Sent to a brothel, Theodora was rescued by a Christian soldier who switched clothes with her. Plutarch had a very similar story, though in his case, the women allowed the men to escape. Ultimately, both accepted martyrdom, replacing, at least within Ambrose's text, the violence of a disordered marriage and sexuality with consecrated virginity and divine heroism. As he had done with Polyeucte, Corneille inserted into the story a context of family strategy, lust, and violence. The moving force in his plot is Marcel, wife of the governor of Antioch, along with her daughter Flavie. The latter never appears on stage, because she is too busy pining away somewhat creepily for the love of her stepbrother Placide, whose father, Valens, was rescued from political and economic ruin by his second marriage to Marcel. Quote, il sut le racheter par ce triste hyménée, et forçant son grand corps à son honteux bien, lui-même il se livra pour rançon de son bien. The point being that this marriage to retrieve his political and financial position was explicitly anti-heroic. The original sin of this plot was thus the corruption of family strategy by avarice, faction, and lust. And as in Camus' stories, violence was the inevitable result. More directly than in Polyeucte, the violence of martyrdom was integrated into that dynamic. Marcel, through Valens, targeted Theodore because Placide was in love with her, and thus refused the hand of Flavie. And Flavie really weirdly never appears on the stage, to the point where I kind of wonder if she wasn't like written out because they were short an actress or something. There's lots of strange things about this play. But the result is that all of the evil is concentrated in Marcel. The way Corneille structured the characters, though perhaps not ideal from a dramatic perspective, had the virtue of clarifying the play's moral universe. The male characters are drawn in shades of gray, and with a partial exception of the soldier Didine, who following the Italian models is also in love with Theodore, they are fairly ineffective. Most of the action is precipitated by Theodore, whose faith and virtue are unwavering, and by Marcel, who is entirely consumed by ambition and bloodlust. By the end, with her daughter dead, she takes over the persecution herself. Que ne puis-je aussi bien immoler la Flavie, tous les chrétiens ensemble et toute la Syrie. Why can I not sacrifice to Flavia all the Christians together and all of Syria? And it is significant, I think, that she goes beyond just the Christians there. And indeed, she ultimately stabs Theodora and Didyme to death with her own hands. They, and presumably the audience, take this as establishing them as divine models, a heavenly couple, united solely by the love of God. Didyme's last word is Dieu, while Théodore says, slightly more loquaciously, Ainsi ce combat que la vertu nous donne, nous sortirons tous deux avec une couronne. From this combat, which virtue has given to us, we will both come out with a crown of victory. But in fact, this devotion to a saga of familial violence somewhat displaces the religious message. Having Théodore die as a victim of private vengeance, rather than of systematic religious persecution, doubles down on Ambrose's suggestion that Theodore was a martyr to her withdrawal from the marriage market, rather than to Christianity in general. For Ambrose, this made her a suitable exemplar for consecrated virgins. Corneille believed that her exemplarity extended to French elite society as a whole, including, presumably, women in the world. He may not have been correct. The play closed after half a dozen performances. In the 1667 Traité de la Comédie, he was against it. The Jansenist moralist Pierre Nicole took aim in particular at Corneille's martyrdoms. One of his arguments for the impossibility of representing Christian virtue as opposed to vicious concupiscence on stage, and thus making the theatre into the kind of moral example which the first half of the century had been so concerned, was as follows, quote, "It is so true that theatre is almost always a representation of vicious passions that most Christian virtues cannot appear on stage. Silence, patience, moderation, wisdom, poverty, penitence are not virtues that could entertain spectators. And above all, you will never hear humility nor acceptance of injuries spoken of. And the devotion of these theatre saints always has to be a little bit gallant." Marc Mahory thinks that there he was specifically attacking Corneille's reliance on his Italian models. And if Marc Mahory says it, it's almost certainly true. One should probably take this bit of amateur literary criticism seriously, though, because in a way it corresponded with Corneille's own evaluation of why his play did not have the success he had hoped. Looking at it closely, he said in his example, if there are some vigorous and lively characters, there are some that drag, that cannot have much charm or grandeur in the theatre. That of Théodore is entirely cold. She has no passion that motivates her, and even when her zeal for God, which occupies all her soul, should shine forth the most, I gave her so little heat that that scene, even though it is very short, does not fail to be boring. Moreover, to speak straightforwardly, a virgin and martyr in a theatre is nothing but a logical term that has no arms or legs, and thus no action. Nicole believed that Corneille had sacrificed religious propriety to theatrical logic, while Corneille thought they had committed the precise opposite fault. But they agreed that heroic sanctity and theatrical heroism were not truly compatible. Over the course of a generation, a slippage that had seemed subconsciously natural to Camus' copy editors had become a contradiction in terms. The obvious culprit was the rise of Jansenism and the rigorous turn in French religion and culture. It was not, of course, that these movements opposed Christian heroism or were indifferent to the chaos of familial and sexual violence. But they did propose a much more otherworldly form of Christian virtue, and perhaps especially of female virtue. The image that comes to my mind when I think of female Christian virtue in the Jansenist imagination is Philippe de Champagne's ex-voto portrait of his sister, Angélique Arnaud, where they sit isolated and illuminated in their cell, in their full habits. A more strictly Augustinian theology also made the prospect of reforming society, even symbolically, through heroic exemplarity, much less plausible. For Jansenists, roughly speaking, reform could only come through the irresistible motions of divine grace, or, in the alternative, through the careful engineering of self-interested, concupiscent amour propre. At the same time, and for reasons that were not unrelated, France went through a significant literary transformation, as the canons of classicism hardened, and what Fumaroli has analyzed as the Asianist rhetoric, associated with the Jesuits and the Italian Counter-Reformation, and relying on the emotional immediacy of its approach to reform the passions, was increasingly deprecated. Corneille famously stepped away from the theatre for a decade. One play after Theodora, he had 2 flops in a row. And when he returned, the martyr drama had dropped from his repertoire. Finally, one must consider the political situation in the wake of the Fronde. According to the conventional account, aristocratic and perhaps especially feminine heroism was discredited, while the quasi-magical virtues of royal authority increasingly crowded out all other modes of social transformation through the 1660s and 1670s. There's no doubt a considerable oversimplification, though I have not really looked into the question yet. But I do think, and this is likely where kind of this story connects to the rest of the larger project that I'm working on, that many of these same issues arose from the 1680s, particularly around the influence of Madame de Maintenon, the project of liquidating French Protestantism, and perhaps even the Quietist controversy, all of which, as anybody who's ever looked into it knows, were very, very closely related to each other. Madame de Miramion became one of Madame de Maintenon's right-hand women in that project. And among other things, the house of the sort of what we'd now call maybe a urban mission that she ran, the Miramion, was where young Protestant girls who were being coerced into Catholicism but were not quite aristocratic enough for Madame de Maintenon's foundations were set. There's more to it than that. And it's a very different world, but it involves putting women and family strategies back at the center of French religious life. And it involves, in a far more coercive and authoritarian mode, the use of this to impose a certain kind of order on society, an order that is seen as finally putting an end to the cycle of violence that goes back to the wars of religion. So Madame de Miramion forms a connecting thread there, and at any rate, this was the central domestic initiative of Louis XIV's later reign. Like most of what he did in that period, it didn't end particularly happily, but it also reshaped French culture quite profoundly. So that in that way, at least, the impact of the mid-century fascination with familial violence and Christian heroism continued its influence well into the 18th century.
Just been reading, but I've been reading Mark Bryant's manuscript on Madame de Maintenon.
Yeah.
Her name popped up a lot.
Yeah, no, Madame de Miramion, she's the thread that I was following back into this. And she's a bizarre and amazing character. And that particular story, among other things, it appeared in the Mémoires de D'Artagnan.
Really?
With D'Artagnan cast as the hero who saves her.
Right.
I looked, and I'm pretty sure that Dumas did not explicitly take that episode into his D'Artagnan novels. But if you remember, I'm sure everybody has more or less memorized the Thomas Goodell. The thing that sets the whole action in motion. When D'Artagnan has his first assignation with, what's her name? Constance, yeah. It's supposed to be in a house at Saint-Cloud. And she is kidnapped, thrown into a carriage, and driven away. I'm pretty sure that's where he got this. Right. So that's how it shows up in Dumas.
Fascinating. All right, questions? I'll start off with one actually that sort of an Italian question, for lack of a better term. As you were telling this story, I kept thinking about Artemisia Gentileschi making a living by doing endless copies of her Holofernes and Judith holding the head of Holofernes, that the first one was so popular, which she does in response to a personal situation, but it proved so popular that then she couldn't do any other paintings because she kept getting paid so much money. So clearly this kind of violence at the core of sexuality, families, was hardly something unique to French culture in this moment.
That is Judith and Holofernes. That's also the first incident, the first picture in Lemoine's Galerie des Femmes Fortes. It shows up everywhere. So yeah, I think that's and it's a difficult one, right? Because it features again more in the Plutarchan mode, women actually carrying out the violence. Hopefully in this case,
rather graphically.
Very graphically, yes. And bringing it to a successful conclusion, but it is still very much kind of the same logic of vendetta and sexual violence, which I think that there's many people just portray, but I think there's also a desire to find ways to get around it, but I'm not sure they have an enormous amount of success coming up with plausible accounts of how you can get around it.
And so this kind of building off this vendetta kind of focuses something more of a progression from like Lucrezia story, who is self-martyring to avoid it rather out of revenge. It's not out of revenge, it's out of self-preservation.
Exactly.
So we're seeing this kind of progression towards feminine, still this dueling revenge thing. They're getting it through a different kind of way.
Yeah, so I think that the impulse is to rewrite this as martyrdom, to rewrite it specifically as Christian devotion, and ultimately I think there's probably kind of two elements of this. One, that this is plausible, and because of the devout movement, because by the even the first third of the 17th century, the heroic Christian virtue has become an identifiable part, particularly of French immigrant culture. So suggesting ways that this could kind of solve concrete social problems, I think was attractive. And then, yeah, the other one, which I think is a little bit more abstract, is the idea that ultimately, and this I think is something that goes with the emerging Jansenist sensibility, the idea that ultimately the only way out of this is metaphysical. That ultimately, what you have to do is turn to a divine order. That something like, and Judith and Holofernes is that's liminal, right? Because God specifically told her to do that. But yeah, something like Lucretia, something the pagan examples. As you get more Augustinian, it's really hard to see how that solves anything. Right? Whereas if you have this kind of Aufhebung through martyrdom or some other process, again, this is not necessarily going to solve your social problems, but it may solve the kind of spiritual problem of living in that society, and the promise of a true order, even if only after death.
Can you give a sense of where this fits into the broader book project that you're currently working on?
Sort of. Because and this is one of the things I'm still trying to sort out. But yeah, so where this starts, right, is the idea that there are a number of religious models that are put forward really in the reign of Louis XIV. That in the reign of Louis XIV, it gets, I think, really fairly nitty-gritty. So the one part of this that I've really worked up in detail has to do with concepts of religious vocation, which is developed at enormous length in the Catholic pious literature of the reign of Louis XIV. And there's very concrete kind of guides for how you discern your vocation, how vocation works in a religious sense, how grace connects to vocation, which, not surprisingly, wind up serving to reinforce a very fine Louis XIV vision of society in which you're ordered according to your service to the monarchy. And I think that, so I think where this fits in is that then another of these projects, also in reign of Louis XIV, is this project of subordinating family strategy to royalist religious prerogatives. And it's Caroline Lugi's work on the conversion of Protestants that really kind of brought this home to me. The degree to which the conversion of Protestants was not just illegal and military, but really organized as a family affair. And how much of it ran through Madame de Maintenon.
And Mark's book shows how her own family. You can see it running through her own family, classic example.
And yeah, she her own, what was her nephews were grist to that mill, not in a particularly pleasant way.
No.
So really where this fits in is that this is sort of the prehistory for me of where that comes from, because Madame de Maintenon is, as you read the kind of classic histories of the reign of Louis XIV, she's a little bit of a bolt from the blue. She shows up and suddenly the religious politics of the court does a 180. But obviously she brings with her an entire culture and way of thought, and it's one that has been related to royalist priorities going back definitely as far as Richelieu, if not further. So that's where I think I want to kind of tie this into a broader project. This is, if you want, an earlier version of this that never quite took off. But although it did have an impact, I think, more on the literary side than in terms of practical projects in the century. The other project of this, which is not a book project per se, but just one of my ongoing obsessions, is Cochnet's social thought, which I've come back to 3 or 4 different times over the course of my career, and working with different plays. And so if I live to be 120, maybe I'll eventually get to all of his plays. And
looking also at the theatrics that he wrote for the Academy and that he published in 1661, something like that, which has some really fascinating stuff about his sort of social and political thought in relationship with that with the book. I have a question about the middle of the century and this sort of, intersection with Eliane Viano's work or Sophie Vergenne's book on the Frondeuse and her sort of, Amazonian heroes of the 1650s. And of course, it doesn't work out too well for all of them. And how do you feel that intersects?
Yeah, again, this is
heroic literary style that they're not exactly Christian heroines.
No, although I think they would have liked to think of themselves that way.
Of course.
But yeah, so I think that this is the world they come out of. And I do think you certainly see this with the Duchesse de Montpensier. One thing that I didn't put in here, but it's worth doing, is kind of doing a close reading of her account of her takeover in the Parisian Fronde. And she, at every step, she's very explicit that she is doing this as her father is failing in his duties. and she in fact more or less officially gets, what really happens is she like bugs him until he says, okay, you do it. But yeah, the idea that specifically heroic women, they appear because of the failures of that particular violent but perhaps not terribly competent male culture. And so I think that that's one place they come from. I do suspect that the ultimate failure and discrediting of the fondus is one of the reasons why you don't see this kind of narrative much anymore after the 1650s. And that there has to be a recasting of female heroism in France, which I'm probably going to try to look into now, but I haven't gotten to yet.
So I'll ask a question on Natalie's behalf here. How do you, does this have the influence of Madame de Lafayette? Might as well get it.
Yeah.
Free comment.
The real answer is I would have to spend about 5 months reading Madame de Lafayette to could answer that question, because boy, is there a lot of her. I think some. And yeah, and one issue is the relation. Madame de Miramillon was identified as a précieuse for reasons I'm not at all sure that there were good reasons for that, but the accounts of her, particularly of this event, often mention her as a précieuse. And I think there's definitely a link there between précieuse, or generally that kind of heroic literary tradition, female literary tradition in 17th century France. I'm not entirely sure what the social endgame of Madame de Lafayette or the Précieuse or the Salon novel was. And I haven't read enough of them to have really my own opinion, and what I've seen in the secondary literature, nothing has really sort of satisfied me. And there is certainly this idea of the creation of an idealized social world that is governed by abstract principle and a certain kind of equality, which is not the same thing, but may be compatible with this idea of heroic Christianity that erases the violence of French aristocratic culture. So I think they're related. I think it's an issue that would be very interesting to dig into, but it would require reading Salon novels until smoke came out your ears.
I tried. Natalie's working on a paper related to Madame de Lafayette.
I mean, you may have a better idea, may well have a better idea than I do what the answer to that question might be.
I don't think so. I mean, I'm working on her work on the way that she represents Catherine de Medici and Diane de Poitiers and all of them. So it might be that her novel on the Princess of Montpensier might be a better place.
Yeah, that would probably be where you'd see more of that.
Yeah, but it is an interesting connection.
Yeah, I have a question about 17th century pious literature. So I have not checked too much pious literature in the former part of the 17th century. So is there any mention about the a political connotation of the Protestants? Because it's I checked the Bishop of Bayeux is some, for example, is he wrote a request to the king 1660s. He always emphasized that it's these Protestants is not just a religious traitor, but also they always a political dissenter. So is there any the connection or mention in this kind of pious religion?
And it certainly shows up in Richelieu. And not just in his things like his political testament, but it shows up in the stuff that he wrote as Bishop of Luçon. He produced a pretty substantial set of things there. And the classic account, though, and I think that this is roughly true, is that French pious literature, starting, I don't know, maybe sometime in the 1620s, moves relatively rapidly and fairly substantially away from controversialism. And that their way of dealing with Protestantism, even by mid-century, is to largely claim it doesn't exist. They feel, and I think this is again, this is based just on the secondary literature. I don't really want to kind of put too much weight on it, but I think there's an idea that this was what the authorities wanted. That they thought that controversialist literature was, first of all, giving too much brain space to the Protestants and was tending to increase social tensions that they wanted to decrease, either by not having people attack the Protestants or just by killing the Protestants. They have various strategies. But yeah, so by the time you get, I think it really is the case by the time you get into mid-century. And it shows up in the Jansenist controversy, mainly in the form of everybody calling each other Protestant. And that's something that really annoys the authorities, and they try to crack down on it. But I think it does largely go away from more popular literature that are relatively early.
So,
I have a question. Going back to classical virtue and kind of using that and drawing inspiration and applying it to Christian heroism. So we talked about Lucretia and a lot about Plutarch. But hearing about these stories in the French context in these plays, I thought about Philomena, Medea, Trojan women, and this Greek, very Athenian concept of women maintaining morality within their place, or how they act violently when men do something outside of the social norms. Is there any sign of Greek philosophy being used? And if it's just mostly Roman, is there a reason why they're drawing upon Roman influence more than Greek?
The one-word answer to that question is Racine. That shows up much more in the second half of the century, for reasons which I think have more to do with the history of classical scholarship than anything else. And those texts become much better known. And again, this is something that I don't have an answer to, but for some reason it seems like that specifically Greek Greek classical morality, it seems to fit the Jansenists better. And it's an interesting question why. I think partly because it's about reactions to encountering evil, which is a very Jansenist issue. The evil for Jansenists is just this ineluctable force that you see everywhere. And yeah, of course, Phèdre, Médée, they come across evil and they go ape and break everything. Which again, this is the Jansenist idea of what happens in the face of evil and the absence of grace. No matter who you are, how great you are, if you face the reality of evil without divine grace, the only possible outcome is going to be chaos. And so yeah, so I think there we're into a different theology of how all of this is structured, which is, I think, something that would be interesting to kind of put the two side by side. And reading Theodora and Marcel, I thought about a Médée or a Phèdre. She is in some ways a similar kind of character of a kind of this sort of fire hose of chaos created by grief and suffering. But whereas Phèdre is the single greatest female creation of French drama, Marcel is an absolute flop. So clearly there's something different, right, about the way that that's being approached. So yeah, it occurred to me that would be something worth looking at side by side. And I think that where you'd come to would be that it's a largely a theological difference.
Like 17th-century theology, God forbid. You just read all those chapters about quietism and Jesuit.
Yeah. Oh my God. you can't get the theology out of the 17th century.
No, absolutely not. And it's so fascinating how it interacts with politics, and how, when you talk about, like, back to your thing on Gallicanism, when you see the complexities of the religious politics of 1680s and 90s, and the different people constantly changing chairs, and this ever-evolving process, and it's just fascinating. Anyway, further questions? People are thirsty.
So you're talking about your book project, and you talked about family strategies, right? And so I was wondering, a recent monographs look at the trading contracts, and we're looking at ways. So how are you moving away from that approach?
I guess what I'm trying to do is to, so one of the things about kind of the social history of France we've gotten over the last 20 years is that we now understand, right, how French family life worked on an incredible level of detail in all kinds of different, across all kinds of different social groups and all kinds of different situations. And I think that one thing we need to do now is to go back and look at the theoretical or didactic or normative side, given what we now know about the reality. And so, just take the example that I mentioned in here, Sarah Hanley's old model of the patriarchal compact between the state and the nobility, which I think certainly there's something to it. But I think that if we look at, it was much more complicated than that, right?
Well, it's also,
and it was something that was already impossible, and they knew it.
It's also fascinating how the research in Paris, among the Rodins in Paris, bears out that model to a degree that no other social group anybody's looked at finds the same. The model just doesn't work for merchant families, peasant families, artisan families, provincial noble families. But it does seem to work, based on the Club de Noblesse and stuff like that, for some of these Bourbon families.
Although for them it kept getting messed up by politics and violence.
Yeah.
And Madame de Miramillon was she was connected to the Séguier. She was the high Parisian robe. Her dad had made a ridiculous amount of money in the tax farms.
Well, I mean, you look at, I think about somebody like Guy Rowland's book about, where he's talking about the dynasticism of the Louvois family. At the same time, they're talking about the dynasticism of the royal family. You look at, Louis marrying all his natural children off to the other branches of the royal family. That's not exactly traditional morality. And of course, other branches of the family objected to this on precisely those grounds.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? So, I mean...
Not to mention the Grand Mademoiselle.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, you start looking at these kinds of things and you realize the internal contradictions just keep popping up in the books.
Yeah, and they were, and the obstacles to that patriarchal model were not just crazy kids.
No.
The obstacles were systematic, and the obstacles were coming from inside the house.
Sure.
They were kind of the logic of aristocratic patriarchalism itself frequently militated against patriarchal control, because kind of like patriarch versus patriarch.
Right.
And yeah, they were very aware of the way that this could disturb not just individual families, but the entire social order. And again, like I said, it's not like 17th century France is in any way unique in that.
No.
But particularly in the first half of the century, I think they had a particularly acute case of it.
Well, I've always wanted somebody to do a study of all the families where the man had to take the woman's family name and title, right? Because there are a whole series of major families where the family, marries into, like the Beaufremont marrying to the Courtenay in the 18th century, and it becomes Courtenay-Beaufremont, or, in Brittany, the Rosmadec family takes over the Goulin, but, they then become Marquis de Goulin. And, again and again, we see these families where it's sort of reverse patriarchalism. That's just one little symptom of this. And there's never been a very thorough study of how common that was, because it actually is very common.
Yeah, and of course, then the other classic thing that disturbs that patriarchal order is religious vocation. Like that classic story that I started out with, of the thwarted religious vocation because of your family's marital strategy. And of course, this is something, and again, every single bloody martyr story has this. It's everywhere. It's in the DNA of Christianity. But it is something where they had two just flatly incompatible ideals of divine vocation and of patriarchal marital strategy. If the two conflict, there's no way to come up with a decision. And there's lots of good literature on that.
Sure.
Right? Barbara Diefendorf has that great article on it. There's this wonderful book going through the congregation of regulars at in the papacy, who heard, among other things, appeals to be released from one's vows. And I think, I don't remember whether it was the congregation heard this more or whether it was just a study, but this was looking particularly at nuns asking to be released from their vows. And you get all of these stories of, in this case, it was usually being forced into a vocation because of the family strategy, and then appealing to religious doctrine to get out. So there's all of these logical fissures.
Right. Well, think of the men who become bishops or cardinals who were not ordained priests, and somebody else in the family dies and they suddenly drop out of the ecclesiastical order to get married, keep the family going.
Yeah.
The other part about this is that so many of these religious benefices are absolutely critical to the finances of these various families.
Yeah.
And so quite apart from, the marital strategies, the revenues of a given abbey or convent, like bishopric, provided, this is one of the main things going on in court, making sure that you get these. I'm always struck by those memoirs that were prepared for the Duke of Burgundy in 1698-99 under Fenelon's direction. And they all begin with a long list of all of the benefices in the Généralité that are at the king's disposition and how much revenue each one of them produces, so that they can be handed out to families that deserve to get £100,000 or £5,000, like Luçon was, of course, nickels and dimes. But a lot of this religious vocationalism has to do with solidifying family finances.
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned Christopher Lane, who is at Christendom College, which is, I don't even know where it is. He's really good. And so he's working on the same issues around vocation that I am. But one of the things he's going through, and that's where I got these nuns who resisted attempted rape. He's going through necrologies of religious orders, which will often give kind of potted histories of their vocation. And one of the interesting things he found is that in real life, what they tend to do is find ways to say that it was divine providence, that despite wanting to run off and join the army, they were forced to become a monk in this abbey.
Right.
And then, so look at the rest of his life. It worked out great. So the contradictions here are always kind of very, very deep. And I think a lot of what I'm interested in is kind of how did they express and deal with and try to minimize the contradictions.
All right. Well, let's reconvene upstairs. Thanks.